Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre. This week, the elections are over, well, most of them anyway, and we'll take a look at what the results mean for immigration policy. And with cabinet shuffles underway, how might the administration's approach on immigration change? All that just ahead. Before we get started, please remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today are the regular gang, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hey, Jordan.
Laura Hall, Senior Manager at BPC Action. Hey, Laura.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Policy Analyst. Hi, Cris.
Hey, Jordan.
First, let's catch up on the results of last week's midterms. Democrats took control of the House, and Republicans are going to gain probably 2 seats in the Senate, which sets up 2 years of divided government. As we talked about on the last episode, President Trump made immigration issues like the migrant caravan and birthright citizenship key topics in the home stretch of the campaign. Now, we question whether that would help his cause last time, but with the benefit of some results, how do you all think that strategy played out?
Well, I think it was a little bit of a mixed bag. As we said last episode, he was trying definitely to gin up his base with the harsh talk around the migrant caravan and sending troops to the border. But that also risked ginning up the Democratic base to vote in opposition. And so what we saw is, particularly in a lot of the suburban districts that had been trending maybe more Democratic in recent elections, that cost him a lot of those seats as Democrats turned out in large portion to vote against the president and his policies. Meanwhile, in statewide elections that were close, particularly in states like Texas, we saw, that probably helped turn out Republicans for their base and helped Ted Cruz win, for example. So I think it was a little bit of a mixed strategy. The other thing that we saw from some exit polling, and we kind of knew this going in, is that for Republican voters, immigration is a much more important issue. They are much more likely to vote in part on their immigration positions than Democrats. So, for example, at least one poll, it said, of those people who voted for the Republican candidate, 75% of them said immigration was a very important issue, but only 24% of those who voted for a Democratic candidate said immigration was a very important issue. So again, it's probably more complex than just was immigration the thing. It probably wasn't. But again, in terms of whether it helped or hurt, a mixed bag.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think my takeaway from this election is it's hard to find a takeaway. There were so many different results, so many reasons why people were motivated in some states to come out. If it was for President Trump, against President Trump, it's hard to find one real unifying reason, whether it was immigration or healthcare or the economy, that drove good majorities of people to the polls.
Yeah.
I think there were lots of different motivations and lots of different factors that went into this election, different than others in the past.
I think that's a great point. When you're talking about turnout, historic turnout like we experienced, you're talking about motivated voters on both sides of most of these issues.
Yep.
I think one of the other things that at least is a takeaway is that there was a lot of gains that the Democrats made at the state level with the governor's mansions and flipping several state legislatures, including New York, for instance. And so I think that the implications for that, for anything related to immigration, especially state immigration policies, is going to be pretty profound. But I think I agree with everybody else here that largely, it's a mixed bag and it's hard to have a clear takeaway. A lot of the immigration advocates have been stating that this has been a rebuke of Trump's immigration rhetoric and policy, but I don't think it's that clear. And I think it's really a much more ambiguous result that doesn't really lend itself to any particular interpretation.
I would say also that ambiguity results also from you look at some of the Republicans who lost. Some of the most pro-immigration Republicans, Denham, Valadao in California, Curbelo in Florida, they lost, and they were absolutely opposed to President Trump's immigration policies and very vocal about it, and yet they still lost in their districts. So there clearly was more at play here.
Yeah, I should clarify, Congressman Valadao has not yet been declared the loser, but it is that race is getting tighter by the day. What, if anything, surprised you about the results?
And I touched on it a little bit earlier, just the incredible diversity with why people came to the polls. You know, some people came to the polls to vote for a certain candidate, to vote against a certain candidate, to vote against a certain agenda. Some of these races were so close, and we're seeing that now. The results are still coming in, that the races are narrowing and narrowing because of some of these provisional ballots. I mean, I think the thing that surprised me was just how tight some of them were. I think that they thought that some thought that there might be a blue wave, some thought that there might be a red wall to hold off that blue wave. I think it was a little bit of both. I don't think there was a clear, onslaught above from either side. So that was kind of surprising that the country is pretty divided in a lot of these places.
Yeah, I think it's hard, I think, for either party, although they will probably try, to say that they got a significant mandate to do something or not out of this election. Individual races, individual members who ran on particular platforms will certainly try to move those platforms, believing that's why they won. But in terms of national party politics, I don't think that there was an absolute mandate for either party, and I don't think there was an absolute mandate for either party on immigration.
I keep going back to the point about rural turnout in particular, that I think people were really walking into this assuming that there would be a blue wave, and the results, especially in the House, have been pretty impressive. But I think, one of the things that people start talking about is like, well, there's going to be an increased turnout, and sort of the assumption has been that means that would be benefiting primarily Democrats, and that really isn't the case at all. I'm not surprised that there was a real significant divide between urban and rural voters and the candidates that they supported. I think I was just more surprised to sort of really see that strength among rural voters. The turnout really boosts itself out in the Southeast and in Texas. I would say the other thing is just sort of the Democratic gains in the Midwest. 2 years ago, obviously President Trump, was able to win the presidency largely on the strengths of his performance in the Rust Belt and in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, for instance, and the fact that you started seeing more Democrats being able to take House seats in Pennsylvania or in Wisconsin, for instance, I think, sets up an interesting scenario where they might be seeing some more strength going into 2020 more than anything else.
It just seems like a lot of this, the electorate just gets restless, that every 2 years they want something different. So we'll go one way, we'll go the other way, we'll go one way, we'll go the other way. I don't know if that's going to be something that is with us for the foreseeable future, but I think it shows that they're still kind of unhappy with what's happening in Washington, that they were hoping that President Trump would bring about a big change. Maybe they didn't get that, or they're not feeling that, so let's try this other group for a while. Maybe in 2 years they go back the other way. I think it just shows just a general unhappiness with things.
And that's a good segue into my next question, which is, as Congress moves now from campaigning to governing, has either party begun talking about an immigration agenda in the next Congress? And more broadly, does divided government help or hurt the cause of immigration legislation?
I think the answer is yes. I think everyone's been talking about what their priorities are and kind of what they hope to move. It's clear that President Trump still holds significant sway with Republicans when they're talking about in terms of setting the immigration agenda. I think Republicans will look to him for guidance, whether that's the wall, which is a huge priority, increased interior enforcement activities. And now there's talk about changes to the legal immigration system. We'll have the whole asylum debate a little bit later on in the show. So I think the Republicans are kind of coalescing around his strategy, since he is still kind of the leader of that party. I think Democrats are having a very different set of conversations and a different set of priorities. So they're talking about DREAM and DACA. They're talking about changes to TPS, the temporary protected status. Can they make any adjustments to President Trump's announcements there on the rollback? I think the interesting thing is those agendas are very far apart. And to move anything forward in divided government, you need to have some type of cooperation and bipartisanship. And as of now, I'm not seeing those places where there might be some areas for them to come together. I hope as things progress, they find them, and there may be some small things that we can build on. But right now, it seems that the sides are pretty much at different starting points.
I think Democrats, as they take over the House, have some decisions to make about whether they want to spend the next couple of years proving that they can legislate and govern, or whether they want to spend the next 2 years being in opposition to President Trump. And I don't think that as a whole, they know which way they want to go. There are several members, particularly in the Senate, who are angling for their own 2020 presidential runs. And so they would be better off, certainly, if they could be shown to be in strong opposition to President Trump. But if Democrats want to keep the House and maybe make gains in the Senate, they're probably going to have to show that they know how to legislate as well. So that's going to be a tricky dividing line. And of course, the unknown, as always, is the president himself. Early on in his tenure, he reached out to Democrats. He reached out to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on immigration and other issues, trying to make deals that he later backed off of because his own party, particularly in the House, said that's not helpful for us. Now with Democrats in the House in charge, does he go back and go to them and say, hey, we can work together and we can cut deals? Or does he want to have the Democratic House as a foil to run against in 2020? So the presidential election starts now, if we didn't already think it was there. And that's going to play a lot into the level of cooperation people are going to want to engage in over the next 2 years.
And Theresa makes a good point, too. It's maybe not just the presidential election, as much as we all probably have election fatigue. All these new members of Congress essentially have to start their campaigns now that they just won their seats. So there's, the difference between someone who maybe got elected from a rural Pennsylvania seat and what their priorities are versus someone from, Manhattan that, has X agenda. So the Democratic caucus in the House in and of itself doesn't all have the same agenda. The suburban districts and what they want is very different from what some of these more liberal, very progressive seats are going to want. So I think that's got to play itself out a little bit too.
Yeah, I think the one thing to keep a lookout, or at least over the next few weeks, is also who's going to lead House Democrats. Nancy Pelosi has been angling to return as the head of congressional Democrats in the House, and the question is, she's able to return to being Speaker, what the priorities she'll be setting. But right now it's a little bit contested. Media reports are saying that there are other individuals in the wings. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how that leadership race plays out and what kind of priorities are set because of that. Is she going to try to sort of maybe fend off a challenge from the left flank and try to say we'll hold the ground, we won't try to do any legislation, or is she going to try to maybe pivot more towards the center? There's a whole host of things that we need to see what happens with the leadership race before the new year begins.
And there are also things in play, too, not only the leadership race, all the various caucuses and factions and groups like that. Traditionally, the Hispanic caucus has taken a large lead on immigration policies. Will they continue to be the leaders there? Most likely, they'll have some kind of large role. We don't know exactly, what they'll play, but I think that all is things to keep an eye on, too. These other little groups besides just the elected, Speaker of the House.
On the other side of a quick break, whatever happened to the Caravan? And we're back. Let's turn to the migrant caravan. It was the hottest topic in immigration for a few weeks. How many people are still in that caravan, and where are they now?
So you're right. It was the president talked about it almost daily, probably several times a day up until November 6th. And he has not mentioned it once since November 6th, except the issuance of his asylum policy, which we'll talk about shortly. The caravan is still making its way through Mexico. Several hundred caravan members broke from the main group earlier this week and arrived in Tijuana at the San Isidro port of entry, clearly intending to apply for asylum at that port. It should be known that there are several thousand asylum seekers from Central America already in Tijuana who have come to Tijuana over the last year, who are waiting their turn to come across the border and make their asylum claims. So this new group will get in line behind them. The rest of the caravan is making its way north from Mexico City. They are also looking to go toward Tijuana, and we can talk about why they've decided to go there. It's a little bit longer journey, but they are making their way and are expected to arrive within the next couple of weeks. In total, it looks like there's going to be somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. We don't exactly know how many because the caravan's getting stretched out a little bit. It's worth understanding this seems like an awful lot of people, but as I mentioned, there's already 3,000 people waiting in Tijuana. Border Patrol, the latest numbers from Border Patrol are that CBP and Border Patrol are dealing with that number of people every month coming to the border and asking for asylum right now. So in total, it's not a huge increase from what they're already seeing. The difference is to the extent that they all come at once. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the numbers who have been arriving at San Ysidro, which is the port of entry over between Tijuana and San Diego, it's about, I think, 2,000 people have already arrived there, and there's another 2,000 on their way. It's also worth noting that there actually wasn't just one caravan. There were several caravans. What ended up happening is, I think, a lot of people started realizing, hey, you know what, it's cheaper for us to cheaper and safe for us to start traveling en masse. So there was another caravan that I think it came from Honduras or Guatemala. There's one that came from El Salvador. So at this point, we're dealing with multiple caravans, but all individuals were fleeing similar conditions and largely doing it for the same reason. It's safer to do it in large numbers. They don't have to pay for anything.
Yeah. And again, going back to why Tijuana, if you remember back in 2014, 2015, the lower Texas Rio Grande Valley is where the bulk of the family units and unaccompanied children from Central America had been arriving. But the caravans have tended to go west. And the main reason for that is that the cartels that control the access in California generally are more lenient on the migrant caravans, and the migrants who apply, they're not going to charge them as much money or try to extort them. On the eastern side, coming up toward, McAllen and Brownsville and Rio Grande Valley in Texas, those cartels that control that are more likely to charge larger fees, extortion. There have been mass graves of migrants found in those areas, so it's much more dangerous. So that's another reason why the caravans, based on advice they're getting from some of the organizers, have said, no, let's try to go to Tijuana.
Is your sense that those factors are making these caravans a growing trend? Are we likely to see more of these moving forward?
I think it is for now, but I think it will remain to be seen how they're treated once they arrive, right? For the migrants themselves, clearly it's a safer way. What we don't yet know is, as the waiting lines to apply for asylum get longer, do things get more dangerous for those who are waiting in Tijuana? The migrant shelters in Tijuana are almost full right now. So as thousands more people arrive, will that create conditions in Tijuana that are not healthy and that the migrants are not safe there? Will more of them try to apply in Mexico? We already know several thousand have applied for asylum or other protections in Mexico along the way. That may become more of a way that some of them would decide to go. And we also don't know if they have to wait too long. Will they try to come between the ports of entry, and what happens then? And that's why the president made his declaration, trying to funnel people back to the ports of entry. But we have to kind of see how this is all going to play out.
Ultimately, I think the only thing that they care about is whether they can enter the United States and gain asylum status. And if it's the case that the caravans are not really fulfilling those roles for the individuals who are leaving this part of Latin America, it might be the case that they just start looking at other alternatives. The question is also what is happening at the border, whether that will then increase the capacity of other channels to become more effective for bringing individuals here. So I'm specifically saying that, for instance, that there is the asylum reg. If it's the case that the asylum reg goes into effect, will that then empower smugglers and coyotes who can say, you know what, I can actually guarantee you entry into the United States? Would that make them a little bit more powerful because they can actually guarantee entry into the United States as opposed to a caravan, which will just have to wait and wait and wait? That's really one of those key things where whatever is happening at the border that the U.S. does is going to have an unintended effect with the ways that individuals try to enter the United States.
Yeah, I'd say, one thing that we have learned, having so many migrants clustered in one place and a lot of journalists embedded with them who've been talking to them, is listening to them and their stories and their motivations. And for the majority of them, they really do want to ask for asylum. They want the opportunity to plead their case before an immigration judge. They believe that the United States is a place where the rule of law matters, and they have faith. They're a very deeply religious group, and they really believe that God will take care of them. And if they can just get into the United States to make their claim, then whatever happens from there is in God's hands. And so, they, no matter what it takes, that's their plan. That's what they're going to try to do. If that's blocked between ports of entry, they may not try to evade detection. They may not try to sneak in illegally because they really want the opportunity to, they know that they're not necessarily coming in a regular way, but they think that's the most regular they can be, is to try to get in front of an immigration judge and make their case. So I think that this is, we've said before, this is a new normal. The caravans are a response to, this mechanism that has provided them an opportunity to plead their case. It should be noted that only a small percentage of those who actually do go before an immigration judge actually get asylum. That fact doesn't seem to deter a lot of people from coming and trying.
And I'll close with this. President Trump sent troops to the border to respond to this caravan. What are they doing now?
Well, just the other day, Defense Secretary James Mattis and DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen were at the border looking at what the active duty troops have done. Basically, most of what they were doing was what they call hardening the ports of entry. So one of the things that CBP is concerned about is seeing the visuals of the caravan approaching the Mexico-Guatemala border and sort of overrunning that border port. They're afraid that a lot of the migrants may try to sort of push their way into the port of entry in San Ysidro and other ports of entry. So they're trying to, spread concertina wire and insert barricades. It makes it harder for what they call port running. And so that's a lot of what the military has been doing. Also, just, support roles such as, moving equipment around for Border Patrol agents, finding ways to, help repair fencing and other infrastructure. But it seems like most of what they were called down there to do is just about done. The commander in charge has said he doesn't expect there will be any more troops deployed. There's just below 6,000 total that were deployed in this. So we think that mission is probably almost over for right now, at least.
We'll be back in a moment with a look at new asylum rules. All right, let's jump right back in. President Trump has signed a new executive order putting limits on the instances in which people picked up between ports of entry can seek asylum in the United States. That's part of an effort to discourage both this migrant caravan and future efforts. So how does this new step by the Trump administration impact immigrants' ability to seek asylum in the United States?
So this administration action is actually a two-part action. The first part was a joint regulation issued by Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice that says that if the president were to use his authority to block the entry of individuals between ports of entry who want to claim asylum, then this regulation says that they cannot ask for asylum as part of the removal proceedings. They can still ask for other protections that have a higher bar, things called withholding of removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture, but the regular asylum process will not be available to them. The president then issued that declaration using the same broad authority that he used to issue the travel ban in 2017, and said, I think it's not in the national interest that anybody who comes between ports of entry should be allowed to come in and claim asylum. And so that together, the intent is to tell those who are trying to come to the United States to ask for asylum that they have to go to a port of entry, that they should no longer try to just walk up to any Border Patrol agent they see along the border and say, I want to come in and apply for asylum. In reality, it's not clear what effect this might have. So for on the ground, all this, it doesn't really change anything for Border Patrol. It doesn't really change anything from CBP. If Border Patrol encounters anybody between the port of entry, they still have to apprehend them, take them to the Border Patrol facility, process that individual, indicate they have a fear of returning home. They're transferred to Immigration Customs Enforcement. At that point, an asylum officer will interview them, but instead of the credible fear interview, it will be a withholding or CAT interview. And they still have to be released within 20 days. So if they don't qualify in that initial screening, they either have to be deported back to their country within that 20 days as family units, or they have to be released, in which case they then go before an immigration judge. So on a practical matter, the experience of the immigrant is not going to be that much different than it is right now. But the type of protection they might qualify for would change. I mentioned earlier that a very small percentage of these people who actually go before an immigration judge actually get asylum. Right now, it's hovering between 20 and 30%. A lot lower portion would be eligible for these withholding or Convention Against Torture protections. But the fact that only 20% people get asylum doesn't seem to be a deterrent in and of itself right now anyway. And so I don't see how this change that, frankly, is very, very technical and none of these immigrants will understand unless they have counsel talking to them right now is going to make a huge difference in their plans.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the ACLU and other advocacy groups have filed suit against this action. What are they arguing, and how strong is their case?
So they're arguing first that the regulations that were issued by DHS and DOJ are contrary to the existing immigration law. The asylum law clearly states that any immigrant may apply for asylum once they arrive on U.S. soil, regardless of whether or not they have arrived at a lawful port of entry or any other means, that option is available to them. The regulations are hinging on another part of the law that says the Attorney General can set other conditions or criteria for asylum or bar asylum on other grounds as long as it's consistent with that section. So that's really the criteria there. Is this regulation saying you can't get asylum if you come between a port of entry consistent with that other provision that says you can? In essence, I think the administration is trying to say that the president's authority to deny entry, that big, broad authority that he used under the travel ban that the Supreme Court upheld, is sort of bigger than this limited attorney general authority, kind of, forgive the term, trumps that authority. And under the president's authority, this regulation is therefore legal. So it's kind of trying to bootstrap the attorney general's authority to the president's authority. The ACLU says, yeah, no, that doesn't work. This is far beyond what the law says. It's also in violation of some of our international conventions, which say we have to allow people an opportunity to apply for asylum once they have reached our shores. There is a hearing on this early next week, so we'll know if a judge is going to issue an injunction against this. I think that the administration was probably fully prepared that this would be the case, that it would be sued over. Just about every other action the administration has done to deal with the southern border has gone to litigation, so we'll have to see how this plays out.
The question is whether or not individuals who are coming from the Northern Triangle will actually know about its existence, I think is highly unlikely. And so I think that that's one of those things that needs to be taken into account, that, obviously things that are very public, like family separations, can probably filter down into this region and people will be made aware of it. But this is just such a small technical rule that, the likelihood that people will be aware of it, like I said, it's really unlikely. So, if we start seeing this becoming an issue that, essentially makes it more difficult for people to seek asylum who have been detained between ports of entry, yeah, it might, raise some awareness among the individuals who are coming here. But I think at the moment, it's just too soon to tell. And like I said, it's something that's very much under the radar for a lot of the individuals who are coming here. So we're just going to have to sort of see where people are as they start coming here, and, whether or not this rule stays in place or not, to see what the effect is.
All right, when we come back, we'll wrap up with the cabinet reshuffle. We'll close today with personnel changes. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has been ousted, and various reports say DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly could be next to go. Now, these three have been among the most vocal and effective in implementing the administration's immigration policy. So why would President Trump want to force them out?
Well, when it comes to Attorney General Sessions, you're right. He has been probably the most out front person for the administration on the breadth of its immigration policies. But this was pretty much a personal decision by the president and had everything to do with the Robert Mueller investigation and the special counsel. If you remember, Attorney General Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation very early on. The president saw that as a personal affront that his attorney general did that. He made that very clear, very publicly, very vocally, that he was unhappy with that, and that everything that had preceded in terms of naming of a special counsel and the rest of the investigation, he laid squarely at the feet of that decision. So I think that he waited until after the election so as not to draw away from the message he was trying to carry on for the campaign, but literally the day after the election, he asked the attorney general to resign. When it comes to Secretary Nielsen, and again, there's been no announcement on this, the rumors are just swirling, and the president himself is contributing to that by saying, we have a lot of things we're talking about. But I think it's been pretty publicly known that he's been unsatisfied that she, as Secretary of DHS, has not been able to gain control of the border, stop these caravans from coming, maybe hasn't been as much of a strident public persona on these issues as he might like. But he just has seen that he sees her as somehow ineffective. And I think that that's one of the reasons that he's looking for somebody he feels will be a stronger presence, maybe somebody more like a border sheriff who would, be out there talking more harshly and somehow being more effective. To the secretary's credit, though, it's the president may want a lot, but what she can do under the law and with the resources she has, and again, as we have spoken, all of these tough talk and deterrent effects are not really as effective on this new flow of migration. And she has also been trying to, for example, negotiate with Mexico, with the countries in Central America, trying to find other ways to deal with this that might be more effective. The president doesn't see that as really viable. He doesn't think that's really useful. But she's been doing her best.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is also that the fiscal year 2017 apprehensions numbers were so historically low that if you're going to measure performance based on apprehensions, you're going to fail. I mean, quite frankly, the numbers were going to return back to FY16 levels, FY15 levels eventually. They were just going to revert back to form. And so the whole notion that somehow Secretary Nielsen would be able to hold those numbers down just through whatever policies were being enacted, I think was really creating an unsustainable and unrealistic goal for her performance. And then the thing to remember with the president as well, he's a media guy. He's a marketing guy. He really likes to have the face of individuals to be people who can go out there on TV and really sort of broadcast his message in a really tough, very clear way. He's always looking for that, and I don't think the secretary necessarily fulfilled that need from him.
I think a lot of this comes down to his wall, too. He wants his wall. He feels like, back to Theresa's point, that maybe the people that he thought were his folks to help get this across the line haven't done that so far. I think that is something that he's thinking about.
So what do you all know at this point about who might replace Sessions and Nielsen and Kelly as well, if in fact they do depart?
So what we know is that the president has named Jeff Sessions chief of staff as the acting attorney general, and he is in place now and will be, I guess, until someone else is named. There have been lots of names swirling, but I don't think we have a general understanding of who might take over. The DHS secretary position, again, publicly, some names have been floated. For example, the former acting ICE head Tom Homan, who retired last year. I'm not sure that he would come back. It would be his third time, waiting to be nominated and seeing if he could be confirmed. I think other people in the department. There is no current deputy secretary in the department. That's worth noting. When John Kelly left DHS to go to the White House, Elaine Duke was the deputy secretary. She became acting secretary. But the White House wasn't very happy with her because she, for example, did not take their very strong recommendations on some of the TPS designations and withdrawing some of the TPS designations. She's since resigned. There is no one in that number 2 spot. The undersecretary for management would be the next person in line to move up. But given what happened at the Department of Justice, the president could put someone else entirely in that acting slot. We have to wait and see. And as far as other people from outside the department, I haven't seen or heard of any real credible names that have been floated for that position. If you remember, the president, didn't have a lot of people to replace John Kelly. Kelly was the one who advocated for Kirstjen Nielsen because she worked for him, but there wasn't a long line of other people that he was considering for that position. So it's unclear who he would seek out now.
And given that this person would have to be subject to a confirmation process on Capitol Hill, maybe they're looking for someone who's already kind of been through that, who's already been vetted, who's already had the questions asked of them. So this moves forward a little quicker.
Laura, Theresa, Cris, thanks as always for joining me, and thanks to our listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This Week in Immigration is written by Cris Ramón and myself and produced by Emily Schrader. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.